Some nights don't end, they just stop. The music fades, the lights come up, chairs scrape across the floor, and people spill out into the cold early morning air, laughing, calling for rides, trying to remember where they parked. The night slows down the way nights always do, ordinary, messy, forgettable. But every now and then, someone walks into that ordinary chaos and never walks back out of it.
Dark story sealed by fate. Welcome to Grimy Dates.
Brian Shaffer was 27 years old in the spring of 2006. He was a medical student at Ohio State University, intelligent, funny, well-liked, and by all accounts, someone with a real future in front of him. He wasn't some drifter passing through town. He wasn't someone who had cut ties to everyone around him. He had people. He had plans. He had a life that was very much still in progress, but that life was carrying weight. Just weeks before he disappeared, Brian's mother had died after a battle with cancer. Anyone who has ever tried to function after a loss like that knows grief doesn't always announce itself in dramatic ways. Sometimes it hides in routine, in small talk, in going out with friends because sitting still feels worse. And on the night of March 31st, 2006, that is what Brian did. He went out. Spring break had just begun. And like countless other students in Columbus, he spent the evening drinking with friends. Earlier, he had dinner with his father. Later, he met up with his friend Clint Florence. Clint's friend Meredith Reed joined them too. And sometime after midnight, the group made their way to a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona in the South Campus Gateway complex. Even the name sounds strange in hindsight. The Ugly Tuna Saloona, one of those places that probably felt loud and harmless at the time. A place full of music and people and the usual blur of a Friday night. Security cameras captured Brian and his friends arriving around 1:15 in the morning on April 1st. And for most cases, that would be a tiny detail, just one timestamp among many. But here, every timestamp matters, because that camera footage would become one of the last solid pieces of Brian's story. Inside the bar, the night seems to have been normal. There were no confirmed reports of a fight. No obvious signs that Brian was in immediate danger. No dramatic final confrontation that neatly explains what came next. If there had been, this wouldn't be one of the most unsettling disappearances in modern true crime. At around 1:55 a.m., Brian was seen on surveillance outside the entrance area of the bar, talking casually with two women. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing looked urgent. It was the kind of interaction that would disappear into the background of anyone else's night. Just another conversation, just another moment, but it became the moment people would study for years, because after that, Brian Shaffer was never definitively seen again, and that is where this case begins to slip out of the ordinary and into something colder. When people first hear about Brian's disappearance, they usually latch onto the same detail. He was seen going in, but he was never clearly seen leaving. That sentence is what made this case famous. It's the thing that turned it into one of those mysteries people repeat almost like a legend. The man who walked into a bar and vanished. The medical student swallowed by a building. The case with cameras and no ending. Now, to be fair, investigators never said it was physically impossible for Brian to leave. That is one of the myths that grew around the story. The surveillance system was not perfect, and there were possible alternate routes, including service areas and exits that may not have been fully covered the way people imagine. So no, this wasn't magic, but that almost makes it worse. Because if Brian did leave, then he left in some unnoticed, unremarkable way. And whatever happened after that erased him so completely that nearly 20 years later, there is still no answer. When the bar closed, Brian's friends realized they had become separated from him. At first, that didn't seem like a crisis. In bar districts, people split off all the time. One person goes for food, another catches a ride. Someone heads home without saying much. It happens, especially late, especially when people have been drinking. But Brian didn't come home. He didn't show up the next day. And as the hours passed, the normal explanations started to fall away. Because Brian had plans, real ones. He and his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, were supposed to leave for a trip to Miami, This wasn't a man on the edge of disappearing from life as everyone knew it, at least not in any way that people around him recognized. In fact, there were even reports that Brian may have been planning to propose to Alexis sometime in the near future. Then there was his apartment, his car, his belongings. Nothing about his life seemed arranged for a clean break. And that is what makes voluntary disappearance such a frustrating theory in this case. On paper, it sounds possible. People point to his grief, the pressure of medical school, the emotional disruption of losing his mother. They ask whether maybe he just snapped, maybe he wanted out, maybe he saw the chance to disappear and took it. But when you look at the life he left behind, that theory begins to feel thin. Not impossible, just thin. After Brian disappeared, Alexis repeatedly called his phone, sometimes just to hear his voicemail, sometimes because when someone vanishes, doing nothing feels unbearable. Calling becomes a ritual, a way of refusing the silence. Then months later, one of those calls seemed to ring instead of going directly to voicemail. For a moment, it felt like hope, a live phone, a signal, a suggestion that somewhere, somehow, Brian might still be out there. But that possibility went nowhere. Like so many things in this case, it rose up just enough to hurt and then disappeared again. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, kept looking for answers. He had already lost his wife. Then he lost his son to a mystery no one could explain. You can only imagine the kind of pain that creates, not grief with an ending, but grief with no shape. No funeral, no truth, just a wound that never closes because no one can say what exactly was taken. Then, in 2008, Randy died too after being struck by a falling tree branch during a storm. If this case didn't already feel cursed, that detail pushes it even further into something unbearably sad. So what happened to Brian Shaffer in the early morning hours of April 1st, 2006? Did he slip away unseen and fall victim to something random and brutal in the dark? Did he make a choice no one in his life ever imagined he would make? Was there some small missed moment, some ordinary-looking detail that held the entire truth and was lost forever before anyone realized what they were seeing? No one knows. And maybe that is the real horror of this case, not the idea of a monster in the shadows, not the idea of a hidden tunnel or some impossible vanishing act, but the idea that reality can break this quietly, that a life can end or change forever between one camera angle and the next, that a person can be surrounded by noise and light and people and still disappear into a silence no one can cross. Brian Shaffer walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona on the night of March 31st, 2006. By the early hours of April 1st, he was gone, and nearly 2 decades later, he is still missing. No goodbye, no answer, no ending.
The story ends and darkness waits. I'll see you next time on Grimy Dates.